Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to the today's tutorial session for I think biology. This is an NPTEL course offered by the Azim Premji University, and today is the 10th tutorial for this course. I am Geetika Agarwal, and I'm a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences. And so today is going to go like I'm going to be summarizing what happened, what was covered, the topic covered during this week, and then we'll have a quick Q&A session to give you an idea about what kind of a questions you might be asked during your exam and to test your knowledge. Okay, so this week was mainly about climate change, global warming, how it affects biology, how it affects human beings, how human beings are impacting the environment, and how that is not like that might come back and affect us because we are dependent on this environment and on the earth systems. And in the end, we talk a little bit about biodiversity conservation and what efforts people have been making in order to conserve certain of these species that are dwindling in numbers, right? So, coming to the first main question of what is climate change. So, climate change basically refers to it's not a short term phenomena; it's this long term phenomena, and there are shifts in temperature and the different weather patterns. So these days, you might be noticing that a summer has been starting a lot quicker, and winter has been starting later and later than it used to earlier back in the day. For example, a few years back, sometimes in the 2000s, April didn't used to be this hot, and summer used to kick in eventually at the end of April or something like that, and winter used to start sometime like October started getting a little chilly. But nowadays we see that it's somewhere in November that we actually start feeling the winter, and so that is um, consequence of climate change. So basically, climate change refers to it talks about these long term shifts in temperature and weather patterns, and some of these changes might be natural, they might just be happening because of how the system works, but many of them are actually caused because of human activities, such as burning of fossil fuels, which are main drivers of this increase in temperatures and climate change. So, some of the key causes of climate change, as we discussed already, one of them is burning fossil fuels. There is industrialization. There is these greenhouse gases that have accumulated in the atmosphere, majorly consisting of carbon dioxide and methane, and there is a lot of transport which uses a lot of these fossil fuels that we've been burning, and deforestation that has been happening. These are some key drivers of climate change. And so you might be thinking, okay, fine, whatever, why should we discuss climate change, why is it so important? It's fine. Okay, yeah, summer is starting a little earlier, winter is starting a little late, how is that even important to us? So climate change is actually a very impactful phenomenon. It is altering the entire biology of the earth, and in very drastic ways, that too. It not only affects the weather patterns, but also the sea levels. If the sea levels are rising, you can think about people living in the low level islands, people living in the coastal areas, they get impacted. The areas might just get flooded because of rising sea levels. Then there are these entire ecosystems that are being impacted. For example, we have all of our rainforests, these tropical rainforests, or these ice caps, polar ice caps, which are melting because of climate change, because of increase in global warming. So these are some ecosystems that are directly being impacted, and human societies eventually get impacted by climate change because, as I said, humans are also dependent on the earth's ecosystems. And climate change is a crisis. It's a crisis of a sort that will affect every human individual, whether they have a hand to play in climate change or not, whether they used a lot of fossil fuels or not. But this phenomena is going to impact every human individual and all of our future generations. And in this image, you can see climate change, and there are these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. They have accumulated in the atmosphere, and you might already be aware that earth receives its energy from the sun, and sun is the major source of energy on earth. It gives us heat energy, and it gives us a lot of heat, without which the life on earth would not survive or would not thrive if there was no solar energy coming and heating up the surface. But we also know that at night, when it gets dark, this heat, it gets reflected back from a lot of, and a major chunk of this heat gets reflected back from the earth's surface, and some of it gets absorbed in the oceans. Now, because of this envelope of greenhouse gases that has formed in the atmosphere, these gases have started absorbing a lot of this heat, and they prevent it from escaping back into space, right? And so the heat, it keeps getting it creates this greenhouse effect, because this heat gets trapped in the blanket of these greenhouse gases, and this increases in the rise of the earth surface temperatures. So we have an extreme weather, we have a decreased snow cover because of this increasing temperature, the snow ice caps are melting, and the global temperature is on an all-time high. And because of this increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, a lot of it is getting absorbed into the oceans, which leads to acidification of these oceans, formation of carbonic acid, and you can think about the impact that this have on the marine life, and especially on the life that has shells which are made of calcium carbonate, which start getting dissolved in this because of the increased carbonic acid in the seas. So a lot of these impacts, we'll be discussing them in more detail. But this is why you should know about climate change, and this is why climate change is important and needs to be handled carefully. Okay. Uh, so there are two frameworks which sort of orient you into thinking about climate change. And these two frameworks are actually, one of them is planetary boundaries, and the second one is the sustainable development goals. But I would like to start with planetary boundaries. And it is a framework which was given by a group of environmental scientists and earth system scientists. It was put forth in 2009. This group was actually led by Johan Rockström, and he's from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And there was another professor called Will Steffen from the Australian National University. And they put forth this framework in which they are describing these limits to the impact of human activities in the earth system. So they've come up with these nine processes, and these nine processes are actually important for the life on earth to thrive, for us to survive. And these nine processes are important um, to keep in check. So you have to keep in check these nine processes, because these processes, after anthropogenic activities have been hampering or have been affecting the life on earth, and there is a certain limit to which you can allow these processes to happen and still have a this delicate balance of ecosystem maintained. But what happens when these limits are crossed is that the environment is not able to regulate itself anymore, and we enter the zone of uncertainty. So here in this image you see that this yellow line, the green line here, is actually the safe operating zone. So if the levels of these different processes stay within this green boundary, then it means that okay, fine, the planet can function properly, the earth can self maintain itself. Even if some sort of changes are happening, the nature can still self regulate, because nature is resilient. It has these processes which, if you shift it a little bit, will bring it back to its equilibrium. But if you push it further, you might push it to its tipping point, and it might not be able to come back to its equilibrium state, right? And so after this green line is crossed, you enter into the zone of uncertainty, which till the yellow line here you can see a yellow circle. So this is the zone of uncertainty. And if then you cross the yellow line, which is the high risk line, then you enter the risk zone, after which bringing the nature or the environmental balance back to the equilibrium will be very difficult. So they put forth these nine processes, and they described them as the planetary life support systems. So the framework described nine planetary life support systems. They were essential for maintaining the Holocene state. So we say that the state in which the planet was during the Holocene was a good state, was the safe operating zone in which the ecosystems were working properly and everything was okay. And if you are taken out of that state, that is where we are entering the zone of uncertainty. That is where things are going haywire, and we are facing things like biodiversity loss, climate change, and things like that. So, and what they did was, so they came up with these planetary life support systems with these nine planetary boundaries, and they attempted to quantify at least seven of them. And they have been, they quantified key how much of these boundaries have actually been pushed, and how much, where have the, what is the level of processes right now on the planet. So these nine processes, I'll name them out for you. They're marked here in these different zones. One of them, as we're discussing so far is climate change, and it is being impacted by the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and by the radiative forcing. Then there is overloading with novel entities, which means that if humans are releasing some sort of novel entities into some particulate matter into the atmosphere, so it's overloading of these novel entities into the atmosphere, into the oceans and things like that. Then there is this stratospheric ozone depletion. So you might already be aware of the ozone depletion and its harmful impacts. So luckily it was like we got to know about ozone depletion in time, and ozone depletion has been checked so far, and it might be reversible. So that's one good thing. But yeah, that's the third planetary boundary, is the ozone depletion in the stratospheric layer of the atmosphere. Then there is increase in atmospheric aerosols, and so aerosol loading happening in the atmosphere. So you might be aware of these aerosols, which are these gaseous particles or these small particulate matter, which can float into the air. And so these aerosols, they actually enter into the atmosphere and they stay there for a very long time, so increasing in these aerosol loading in the atmosphere. Then acidification of the oceans is the next one. Then modification, or how these different biogeochemical cycles are changing, and two major ones are the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. So how those biogeochemical flows are getting impacted, or how they are changing, that's another planetary boundary. Freshwater change, how is water changing? Land system change, how is the landscape changing? Because as you might already be aware, humans have been carrying out logging and deforestation for huge chunks of forest in order to either to for timber extraction, or for fossil fuels, or for making highways, making settlements, making industries. So that is a sort of a land use change. And then there is change in the biosphere integrity. How is the biosphere being impacted? How is the integrity of the biosphere being impacted by humans? So these are the 9 planetary boundaries that these group of researchers came up with, and they described them as the planetary life support systems essential for maintaining a desired state of the planet, which is the safe operating state. And they have quantified these and tried to see which ones of these are in the safe operating zone, which one of them are the zone of uncertainty, and which ones of these have passed even the zone of uncertainty. So we talked about these 9 processes. Out of these, there are these three big ones, which include climate change, ocean acidification, and ozone layer. These are the three big ones because they seem to have the highest impact on the Earth's processes. So they have the most widespread impacts. Then there is these 4 processes which are categorized as under the hood processes, which is the changes in the biodiversity integrity, freshwater use, land system changes, and biogeochemical flows. And then there is chemical loading, which you would have guessed already, probably, that loading of aerosols and novel entities that we discussed about. They fall into the chemical loading category, right? So there are these 9 processes. And how have these boundaries progressed over the years? So in 2009, 7 of these boundaries were actually assessed out of 9. And what was seen was that 3 have crossed the zone of uncertainty. So 3 of these boundaries have actually crossed the zone, them being the nitrogen cycle, the biosphere integrity, and the climate change. Then coming to 2015, 7 boundaries were again assessed, and 4 of them have crossed. So one more in 2015, one more, which is the phosphorus cycle, has crossed the uh, zone of uncertainty. None now, just 2 years back, 2023, all the 9 boundaries have been assessed, and 6 of them have crossed the zone of uncertainty, being the loading of the novel entities, both the biogeochemical flows. Then there is change in freshwater, change in land use, then biogeographical biosphere integrity, and climate change. So all of these 6 boundaries have already been crossed. So I think, so we all should realize it by this point, that it is high time for humans to bring back these planetary boundaries, if possible, to their safe operating zone. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to maintain the desired state of the planet, to keep it in a self-regulating state, which can on which the life in general of non-human animals and humans themselves can survive. not just for the sake of us, but also for the sake of our future generation, which is more important. Yeah. So, moving on to what are planetary boundaries, here's this short video by Mongabe, which very clearly explains what are these planetary boundaries and what these researchers were trying to do by defining these boundaries. So, let's have a look.
Earth, oceans, atmosphere. These interconnected systems exist in a delicate balance that has kept conditions on our planet relatively stable for the past 12,000 years. This stability helped humanity flourish. But as our population and civilizations have grown, we've pulled more and more resources away from these life support systems, diverting water, land, and minerals to agriculture, industry, and urban development. People began to wonder, would these pressures eventually prove too much? In 2007, Johan Rockstrom and Will Steffen set out to answer a fundamental question. What is the safe operating space for humanity on planet Earth? In other words, what are the limits of key Earth system processes that we cannot exceed if we want to avoid rapid and catastrophic environmental change? Working with an international team of scientists, they defined 9 processes that keep Earth's life support system stable. They also estimated the limits of how far we could change and exploit these processes before the system would pass a threshold of no return. They suggested limits, called planetary boundaries, guardrails to keep us a safe distance from these catastrophic tipping points. In the 1980s, scientists found that chemicals called CFCs were degrading the ozone layer, a thin atmospheric layer that absorbs some of the dangerous wavelengths of ultraviolet radiation from the sun and acts like a protective layer of sunscreen for the planet. But ozone-damaging CFCs were being used then all over the world in refrigerators, aerosol cans, and other products. Alarming satellite data revealed a dangerous thinning of ozone over the Antarctic. In response to this existential threat, the world's nations met in 1987 and signed the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. They started phasing out CFC use. Today, the ozone layer is in recovery, and it's hoped the damage to this vital life support system will be repaired by 2050. Humanity, for the first time, had stepped back from overshooting a planetary boundary. In addition to the ozone layer, Rockstrom and Steffen identified 8 other planetary boundaries: biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus, climate change, ocean acidification, freshwater consumption, biodiversity, land system change, atmospheric aerosol pollution, and chemical pollution. Because these processes are interlinked, passing a threshold in one area can lead to a cascade of changes, destabilising other systems, causing them to topple like dominoes beyond our control. For example, climate change, a planetary boundary, is triggered by increasing atmospheric carbon emissions. But that excess carbon also causes ocean acidification, a second planetary boundary, which in turn impacts marine species like corals and fish, destabilising biodiversity, yet another planetary boundary. Likewise, deforestation by agribusiness in huge tropical forests, as seen in the Amazon, reduces the amount of water evaporating from leaves, which reduces rainfall, causing forests to transition into dry savannas and possibly altering weather systems across entire continents. In this case, land use change helps generate climate change, which diminishes biodiversity, which brings more climate change. Diverse ecosystems are essential to provide us with food, clean water, materials, medicine, even flood defences. And it's these ecosystem services that are vital to the human future. Estimates suggest we're already living outside the safe zone for at least 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries, putting Earth on course for disruptive changes in our life support system not experienced for tens of thousands of years. The concept of planetary boundaries was developed as a guide to help us keep Earth conditions within a safe range. Now, Overshoot underlines the urgency of the sustainability crisis confronting us. But the first planetary boundary we crossed offers us a hopeful path ahead. If nations can come together, as they did to meet the CFC threat to the ozone layer, then we can address climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and more. Then there's a chance Earth, oceans, atmosphere.
Yeah. So, I guess I hope that was helpful, and I hope that now you'll be better able to appreciate these 9 planetary boundaries that were being discussed by Johan and Will Steffen, and why they came up with these, and why it's very important for humans to maintain each of these within the safe zone and not overshoot these planetary boundaries, because otherwise, we might not be able to bring Earth back to its equilibrium state, right? And we also understood in the video that a lot of these boundaries are actually interconnected, like they discussed. If there is climate change, that's because of increasing carbon dioxide. Increasing carbon dioxide is also causing ocean acidification. Acidification is impacting the the biodiversity in the oceans, which actually leads to the another biosphere integrity, which is the planetary another planetary boundary getting impacted. So all of these planetary boundaries are in some way or the other connected with each other, right? So yeah, that was about this framework. And so moving on to global warming versus climate change. So why when we discuss global warming and climate change, a lot of the times these two terms are used very interchangeably. And but as scientists, we should be aware that they are not exactly the same term, and there's a reason why we have two different terms, and we should be aware of how they are different from each other. So, global warming is actually the rise in the global temperatures, which is mainly happening because of accumulation of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is happening because of a result of burning of fossil fuels, right? So, that is essentially global warming, which is basically rise in the global temperatures. Climate change is an umbrella term which includes global warming as well, but it's an umbrella term which refers to increasing amount of changes that we observe in climate or in other measures of climate over a long time period, extended period of time. For example, if you're seeing disrupted rainfall patterns, you're seeing temperature patterns not as expected, and some wind patterns. So these are changes in seasonality. These are things that fall under climate change. Yeah. So global warming is just about the rise in the global temperatures, but climate change is an umbrella term which includes global warming as one of these things. Now, talking about global warming, so it's been really long that we have been aware about global warming. So in April 1896, so there was this report published by Swante Arrhenius, in which he actually talked about that the amount of carbon dioxide being released in the atmosphere has risen, and this is leading to this greenhouse effect, this blanket effect, and the earth temperatures are rising because of this and because of the presence of. So here it says, um, we can very well read here, is the mean temperature of the ground in any way influenced by the presence of heat absorbing gases in the atmosphere? So they were actually, so far back, they were actually aware of how certain things are going to impact the atmosphere and the climate of the earth. Then in then GS Calendar, he put forth this report sometime in the 1900s, the artificial production of carbon dioxide and its influence in temperatures. So he has also written that by fuel combustion, man has added around 150,000 million tons of carbon dioxide into the air during the past half century. So during the past 50 years, basically. And the author is estimating from the best available data that approximately three-fourths of this is remained in the atmosphere. So if you have released 150,000 million tons of carbon dioxide, three-fourths of it has remained within the atmosphere. And the radiation absorption coefficients of carbon dioxide and water vapor are used to show the effect of carbon dioxide on sky radiation. So again, another report was published in which they measured how much carbon dioxide has been released by humans in the past 50 years and how that is impacting the atmosphere. Then in 1958, Charles Keeling, he actually started measuring the atmospheric carbon dioxide in this long term thing, which is even now it is measuring the carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. And this setup was done in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and it regularly measures the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in this observatory. And you can see that since 1960s to now, the carbon dioxide levels have been steadily increasing only, right? So we see that carbon dioxide emissions have been increasing on the face of the earth, which is leading to more and more global warming and more ocean acidification. So then IPCC came into being, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? So it's a United Nations body, and it accesses the climate change science, the science behind climate change. That is what IPCC handles. And so the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program, both of them came together and they set up IPCC in 1988. And IPCC tracks climate change, and what it uses to track the climate change is the global surface temperature. So, what is the temperature on the surface of the Earth? Global ocean surface pH. So, what is the pH? In order to measure the ocean acidification, you need to know the pH. September Arctic Sea ice area. So, how much ice cover is there in the Arctic Sea still in the month of September every year? And global mean sea level change. How is the mean sea level changing? Is the sea level rising? Because that is going to be another threat to not just humans but to life in general on Earth. So these are some things that IPCC has been measuring in order to take care of climate change. And what it uses to make these measurements are paleo records, which is the records that they find deep inside the earth, which come from which give you an idea about the past levels of these different things. So paleo records help you to get an idea of what the temperatures were, what the ice cover was earlier in the past, and what it is now. And they make observations and they run simulations and they also come up with theoretical explanations for what is happening, right? Then here you see that carbon dioxide concentration is actually quite related to the increase in the global temperature. So you have global temperature on the y-axis in degree Fahrenheit, and you also have carbon dioxide concentration. So this curve shows that from 1880 to now, carbon dioxide has been steadily increasing. And earlier, in around 1880, we had lower temperatures, and then there was even a dip in temperature around somewhere in 1900s. But then after that, temperature has been very steadily rising after the 1960s. And so, with the increase in carbon dioxide, temperature has also been steadily rising, which is a cause for concern. Then came the UNFCCC and the COP. So, UNFCCC is actually the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was established in the Earth Summit in de Janeiro in 1992. And it's an international treaty which has been signed by a lot of the countries, India also being a part of them. And it has been signed to in order to combat climate change. And this it's been planned in order by limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So we're planning to combat climate change by limiting the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and by also adapting to the impacts of climate change that have already happened. And right now, there are 198 countries which are a party to this treaty. And COP, in turn, is actually the annual meeting of all of the countries that are a part of the UNFCCC. And it's a platform where they actually review the progress that has been made so far. They negotiate new commitments that, okay, what should be done moving forward, and they set some global climate goals, right? So, this is what is UNFCCC and COP. So, what happens in the COP? So, we have had these five meetings so far. Started in 1992 in Rio, then 97 in Kyoto, then 2009 Copenhagen, Paris, Glasgow, and so on. India joined it here even in Paris, uh, became a part of the UNFCCC or the COP, the Conference of Parties, which are a part of UNFCCC, right? So they meet every 4 5 years, and they discuss every 7 years, and they discuss what is going on, right? Moving on to so there are these different shared socio-economic pathways that these countries have come up with, and this is a way of achieving the mitigation of climate change and adapting to climate change. And these different shared socio-economic pathways help you do that. And so there are these five different pathways, and they have five different outlooks towards how to deal with climate change. SSP1. So on the x-axis you have increasing challenges to mitigation. So if the challenges are increasing to mitigation, and x-axis has increasing challenges to adaptation, right? So if you're talking about low SSP1, in this we talk about both mitigating and adapting. So we're talking about sustainability. So SSP1 talks about sustainability, and it discusses how, or this is the approach in which they talk about taking the green road. So it's a policy focused on sustainable development, and they're trying to reduce the inequality within countries and across countries. And they talk about lowering the populations and lowering the consumption. Then comes the SSP2, in which it's a middle of the road approach, in which you want to continue with the current development patterns. So, how development is happening right now. Want to continue with that. Do not talk about sustainable development, but they would bring that in once the countries have reached an okay amount of development. So SSP3, in which it is a rocky road. Here you talk about, okay, fine, we want to only focus on our security, and we want to put there, they put barriers to international trade. There is a lot of inequality, and it's going to have a slow economic growth if we take this regional rivalry pathway. So there are these different pathways that the countries could be taking on, and if and there are different outcomes that will happen to countries taking these different pathways. So first pathway is the pathway of sustainability. Second pathway is the middle of the road. Third is of regional rivalry. Fourth is of inequality, in which the uh, policy is actually focused on elite countries. They talk about high consumption and high inequality, and there is not much economic growth. There is only low to medium economic growth happening in if you take the SSP4 pathway. And in rich countries, the population growth will be low, but in other countries, population growth will be high. And then there is SSP5, the fifth pathway that you can take, which is fossil fuel development. So you want to take the highway, so you do not think about mitigation at all. It talks about freeing the markets. There is a lot of consumption, but there is still effective international cooperation, and they try and reduce inequality, but they're trying to increase growth, but that is going to impact climate change. So SSP1 and SSP2 seem to be the pathways to be taking, like, that can help us actually control climate change. But yeah, so climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So mitigation talks about avoiding reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So you want to nip it in the bud, and they want to avoid altogether the emissions of greenhouse gases. And small to medium sized enterprises in climate change mitigation, they focus on different things, such as they talk about renewable energy sources. They talk about improving the cookstuffs that we use, using solar energy, reducing the carbon products, and managing wastes. And adaptation is how we want to adjust to the consequences of climate change that have already happened. And here the enterprises, they focus on uh, talking about climate resilient production, making conserving the biodiversity, making such crops which are actually resilient to climate change, so that you can still get food. Then warning systems in if you have, tsunamis and things like that because of climate change. And then storing food and water for such times, and then efficient use of resources, things like that. But something to keep in mind is that these two things are not exclusive. They have a zone of overlap. There is an intercommunication between mitigation and adaptation, and you do need. And this zone of overlap talks about how to conserve energy and how to conserve water, educating the crowd, upskilling the people so that they know about climate change, they know about its impacts, they know how to mitigate it, and how to become smarter in using different technologies that are available to us, and sustainably using land and forests, so that we benefit from them as much as they, without impacting their ability, without harming their um, equilibrium, right? So this is about climate change mitigation and adaptation. So how can we reduce our impact? So we've impacted the environment so much by habitat degradation, deforestation, burning of fossil fuels, releasing so much carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, things like that. And so much built up area we have now, we've reduced the green cover significantly. So how can we reduce our impact? So one thing is that maybe we can reduce our population first of all, because lower the population, the lower the amount of consumption that will be happening on the planet. Then we could reduce the technological advances, but maybe that's not a very good solution, because uh, humans don't want to stop making technological advances. They like having technology. You like having machines to make your life easier. So yeah, it's a little difficult on this side. And reducing affluence. So when we talk about reducing affluence, so affluence means having a lot of possessions, a lot of these worldly possessions, a lot of wealth. in hand. And reducing affluence means you turn a little bit to minimalism, right? So you reduce the amount of possessions that you have. You reduce, so basically, you reduce the amount of consumption that individuals or families do. So that brings us to sustainability and sustainable development. So a second way of looking at climate change is actually the sustainable development goals that were put forth by the UN. And we'll come to those in a little bit. So first let's talk about what is sustainability and what is sustainable development. So what is sustainability? So the term sustainability actually comes from the Latin word sustenere, and to sustain can actually mean to support and to maintain. So sustainability is basically the ability to continue over a long period of time. So if you talk about sustaining, that means that something can continue over a long period of time. That is what is sustainability. And if you talk more scientifically, sustainability is actually the ability to meet the current human needs for natural resources without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So when talking about sustainability, it is to have such a development in which you are able to meet the needs of current human beings. So you're able to meet the current human needs for natural resources, but you're also not hampering or compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Because right now, the path that we're on, we're actually compromising the future generations' ability to meet their needs, because we would have used so much fossil fuel by the time that the future generations will not have anything to rely on. They will not have any energy sources to rely on. So sustainability talks about it, talks about meeting the current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It also means that humans should manage the natural resources in a way that the environment does not face a decline from these stresses that we impose on the systems of life, right? So humans, they need to come up with these ways of managing natural resources so that the environment is not getting harmed. It's not facing a stress that we're imposing on its systems. So yeah, that is another way of describing sustainability. And Murali 2011 said that as meeting the resource, describes sustainability as meeting the resource and services needs of current and future generations without compromising the health of the ecosystems that provide them. So you want to meet the needs of current and future generations, but you do not want to impact or compromise the health of the ecosystems that are providing these resources, right? That is sustainability. And what are the two key concepts of sustainability? One is talking about the needs, and the other is the idea of limitation. Okay, these are the two key concepts of sustainability. And when we talk about needs, so you should be aware that wants are not needs. So in the definition of sustainability, when you're talking about meeting the needs of the present and the future, we're only talking about genuine requirements without which people cannot live. We're not talking about the wants, we're not talking about the luxuries, we're talking about the genuine requirements that we need to maintain um, uh, an adequate amount of lifestyle without compromising the ecosystems. And what is the idea of limitation? Limitations to meeting the needs while making sure um, that the future generations meet their needs are imposed by the state of technology and social organization. So, limitation to meeting the needs. So, these needs that we're talking about, so there's a limitation to meeting these needs while making sure that the future generations meet their needs. So, these are imposed by the state of technology and social organization. So, there are certain limitations that are imposed by our technology and our social organization in meeting the needs, while also making sure that the future generations will be able to meet their needs when the time comes. So, there are three pillars of sustainability. So, for becoming sustainable, you need to have viability, equitability, and you need to be bearable. So, when you talk about sustainability, you don't just talk about the environment or the planet, you talk about the environment, you talk about the economy, and you talk about the social life of people. So, talk about the planet, the profit that we're making, and the people of the social life, right? These are different things, different pillars. So sustainability has three different. It's thought of as a three-legged stool, which has the environmental leg, the social leg, and the economic leg. So we talk about sustainability. We want to have minimal amount of pollution and waste, or essentially no pollution and no waste. Want to have renewable energy. We want to have conservation practices and restoration practices. When you talk about the social leg, you want the working conditions for all the human beings to be to have like good working conditions, and equally good working conditions actually. And they want to have everyone to have health services and access to these health services. We want to have all the people to have equal access to education services, despite of which economic background they come from. And you want social justice for different communities and cultures. And then comes the economic leg, where we're talking about profitability. So you want everyone to have fair wages, despite of the caste or the sex that they belong to. And you want have everyone to have good jobs. They want to have security, and to maintain a well maintained infrastructure, and to have fair trade. So these are the three legs of sustainability: environment, social life, and economy. So what are the challenges in reaching these goals, in maintaining sustainability? So the challenges right now are that we have a very rapid growth and development. Our population is rising. Our production is rising to meet the demands of this increasing population. Industrialization is at a all-time high. We're facing an economic crisis. Energy requirements are rising. Pollution and waste production are rising, because if consumerism is rising, then of course, as much you consume, there will be waste also, and equal amount of waste will be produced. There's a lot of loss of biodiversity, and we're over harvesting these resources that we have available from the ecosystems without thinking about the ecosystem's health. So there is an unsustainable take to living. So there's an unsustainable way of lifestyle, which is the take, make, and waste model. So you make something that you want, and you waste it. So this is, say, imagine this is the environment, this green circle. And this is a society which is within the environment. The human society is dependent on the environment, it's within the environment. Then there's economy, it's dependent on the society. So you're trying to make a product, for example. So what you do is, first of all, you take the resources from the environment, either by degradation of nature, for extracting these resources using a lot of physical means. And you produce waste here also, while processing these different while extracting these different resources. So there's an increased amount of concentration of waste from extractions. Then you are making products, and while making the products, there is an increased amount of weight production from the byproducts and manufacturing processes, right? And then you actually over consume these different products, and you again produce wastes from product as well, right? So that is the take, make, waste model, that humans just keep on taking resources from the environment. They produce waste at all different levels. While taking the resources, while extracting the resources, there is waste production. While making the product, there is waste production. After consuming the product, there is waste production. So all of these different levels of waste production. And then there is overconsumption, because the population is increasing. So consumerism is increasing, so there is overconsumption of all of these products that are not even required. They're not needs, they're wants. So things to keep in mind are, what is the effect of our actions on natural ecosystems? How are we impacting the natural ecosystems? That is one important thing to keep in mind. Another thing is that all resources are limited, so we need to give time for them to replenish before we keep on extracting and lead to actually finishing all of them. So resources are limited, and we need to give them time to replenish themselves. Need to understand the costs of resources that we consume. So what is the cost of these different resources that we're consuming? It needs to be understood. And sustainability cannot be achieved by one individual alone. There are many different levels at which sustainability functions. Yes, there is a way in which an individual, in which a family can live sustainably. But then there is a community level of sustainability, regional level, national level, and global level. So an individual alone cannot make like an individual's take, a sustainable take on his or her life is good, but that will not make the entire planet sustainable, right? So everybody needs to get an in on this, and understand how to have a sustainable lifestyle, how to meet these goals. So there are certain features of sustainability. So one of them is energy, and then there is waste minimization and pollution prevention. We talk about vehicle and fuel use, talk about water conservation. You're trying to conserve water, you're trying to build sustainable buildings, you're trying to manage the ecosystems, trying to acquire the resources sustainably, and you want to build resilience in these natural ecosystems so that they are not impacted, um, or so that they are able to come back to the state of equilibrium even if they are pushed a little bit out from that equilibrium state, right? So there are these different features of sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, we keep these things in mind, that we want to produce energy in a sustainable manner. We want to minimize the amount of waste that we produce. The vehicles and the fuels that we use, we want to keep that in check. We want to conserve water, build sustainable buildings, manage ecosystems, and build resilience in the ecosystems. Now we come to sustainable development. Now that we've discussed sustainability, let's talk about sustainable development. So when you talk about sustainable development, so the Commission's 1987 Brundtland report provided a definition of sustainable development. Okay, and the report called Our Common Future, it was titled Our Common Future. It defines sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is the same definition as used in sustainability. They mostly have these overlapping definitions with only very slight changes in the two. Sustainability is the long term goal, and sustainable development is actually the process and the pathway by which we achieve this goal. Okay, so that is the key difference between sustainability and sustainable development. Sustainability is the goal that we want to achieve by sustainable development. For example, we want sustainable agriculture and forestry, we can have sustainable production and consumption, and good governance. So, there are these Millennium Development Goals, which were put forward in the Millennium Summit of the United Nations in 2000. There were 8 goals and 21 targets, which were supposed to be achieved by 2015. And these were called the Millennium Development Goals because they were put forth in 2000. So by 2015, they wanted to achieve these 8 goals. Starting from top, it is to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve primary education at a universal level, to promote the equality in genders and to empower women, to reduce child mortality, to improve maternal health, combat diseases like HIV, AIDS, malaria, to ensure the sustainability in the environment, and to develop a global partnership and development for development, right? So these were the Millennium Goals. Then there is the Sustainable Development Goals. These were put forth in 2015 by United Nations. There were 17 goals and 169 targets in total. And we're supposed to be achieving them by 2030. So these 17 goals actually include no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education for all, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure, re- reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water. So you also want to take into account the marine life and how you can protect it, life on land, and peace, justice, and strong institutions and partnerships for goals. So these are the 17 sustainable development goals that were put forth by the UN in 2015 summit. So what are the measures taken by India in implementing these different sustainable development goals? So India has also been a very active member of these different policies that are being made on a universal level. And what India has done is that we've set up Niti Aayog, which is India's premier policy making institution, which is expected to take forward the economic growth of the country. And there is the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and there are these different programs that have been put forth. Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, there is this Awas Yojana, Skill India, Niti Aayog, Startup India, G20, Ujjwala Yojana, Swachh Bharat, and Arogya Yojana, National Health Mission, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Samagri Shiksha. All of these have been implemented. There are these different programs that have been implemented by the government in order to achieve these 17 sustainable development goals. And for achieving environmental sustainability, what we need to do is we need to control the populations, we need to conserve the biodiversity. So different conservation efforts need to be made. We need to reduce consumption and have an efficient way of consuming the resources, of using the resources, reuse and recycle, constrain of non renewable resources, integrated land use and water management, waste management, and creating awareness. These are some different things that are required in order to achieve environmental sustainability. And we want to shift from the take, make, waste model to borrow, use, and return model for sustainable development. So again, we have the environment, society, and the economy. But in the borrow, use, return model, you borrow the resources. So investment in natural capital, you radically produce resources without stressing the environment. So if you want timber, you radically plant trees that will give you the required amount of timber, and you do not want to stress the environment, and you waste less amount of that while borrowing it or while taking it the resources from the environment, then you use it, and you have a responsible amount of consumption and not overconsumption, and you want to return back the waste products. So you want to make the loop in such a way that if even if you have some byproducts or some wastes being produced while making these services, these products, you design it in such a closed loop way that you can return these wastes back to the environment, so that they can act as a fertilizer, or they can act as a starting point for new resources, right? Okay. So we were talking about, so these are the sustainable development goals that were put forth by the UN. Then we are supposed to now talk about the effects of warming on the biosphere. So we were talking about global warming. So what are the impacts of warming on the biosphere? So so there are three different impacts, or three different scales at which these impacts can be studied. There's this global scale, there is the ecosystem level, and then there's the individual level. So on the global level, you see range extinctions, you see shifts in phenology, and you see tiebacks in forests. We'll come to these in more detail, but these are these global scale impacts that climate change or global warming has. Then there is ecosystem level changes, like coral reefs are getting impacted, invasive species are spreading within ecosystems, and there are individual level changes in which individuals' physiologies are being impacted because of the warming of the environment, right? Yeah. So moving on to these global impacts, range shifts. So animals and plants are actually shifting their spatial distribution in order to track their climatic niche. So all of us, all of the plants and animals on on the globe, they actually have this limit in temperature in which they can actually survive optimally. So mostly you see that there is a normal curve, and in the middle is this optimum range of temperatures where these animals can survive well. And now, as the temperatures are rising on the surface of the earth, animals are tracking their optimum temperatures of survival, their climatic niche, and moving spatially to stay within these temperature limits. So, for example, if you're talking about mountains, birds and insects and other animals, they're actually tracking their optimal temperatures and moving upslope in these mountains, so that they can stay within their climatic niche, so that they can function properly. So animals and plants are shifting their spatial distributions. The ranges are being shifted. Then there are elevational shifts for mountain species. So okay, here in this spatial distribution, you can think about the latitudinal shifts. For example, the uh, animals are actually shifting in latitudes more towards the temperate latitudes because the tropics are getting too hot. Then there are elevational shifts for mountain species, which can cause extinction because certain species they will run out of area, or they will face competition. So if you're talking about a mountain, there is a certain end to the mountain. So the species which are already on the top, where will they go to track their climatic niches? Right, they cannot go further up than that. So their range will get compressed because there is more and more competition from the species that are moving from the lower elevations of the mountain to the higher elevation. And when these species move upwards tracking their niches, you see that the species that are already on the top of the mountain, their ranges get either compressed, or they face a lot of competition, and they will actually run out of area or and face extinction because of these elevational shifts. Then there are other effects such as habitat changes, which are important in deciding the level of change. Uh, right? So habitat change is also an important factor which causes some range shifts. And so there is this study which was done, which talked about climate change and the redistribution of biodiversity in which they actually, it is a review in which they looked at how species are actually moving and shifting their ranges in order to stay within their climatic niches, in order to stay within the temperature range in which they can optimally survive. For example, a lot of species in the northern hemisphere are actually seen to move northwards in the latitude because, as I said, the temperatures are getting hotter. Near the equator, temperatures are rising even more. So, species are moving northwards in order to stay within their optimal temperature ranges, right? Then there is the study by Umesh Srinivasan, and they have a long-term project in which they monitor birds and their movement up the mountains in the eastern Ghats of India, in the Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary and the areas around there. And they also look at the impacts of habitat degradation and logging on these birds. And what they do here is actually they carry out mist netting. So they have these mist nets in which they capture birds, they band them, they ring them, and then they leave them again into the wild, and after a few years they come back and do mist netting again. And then if they recapture these banded birds, they know that these birds have survived and they could survive in these areas. And they know they can measure the amount of stresses that are present in their blood. They can measure the body size of these different birds and how the body size is changing. So what they found is that birds are actually shifting upwards in the elevation while tracking their body temperatures, because in lower elevations the temperatures are rising and they cannot stay in these areas for them to survive properly. And so they keep shifting in the elevation a little higher on the mountains. So the birds that 10 years ago were at a lower elevation, they now find them at a higher elevation, and the ones at the higher elevation are actually undergoing extinction in such habitats. And then there is something called phenology mismatch. So what phenology is actually the timing of seasonal activities. For example, if you have birds, so if you have, sorry, flowers and plants, in plants, so there is some certain timing of leaf senescence, timing of flowering. And then for many plants and animal species, there is a time of breeding in which the during the year, at that point, those animals or those birds or those plants, they become sexually active and they start breeding. For example, birds will start making a nest, have this mating courtship phenomena, and then they will mate and they lay their eggs, and they look after the eggs, and then the the hatchlings will come out, and everything. All of these are actually timed during the year, and these are seasonal activities. They do not happen all over the year for all of these species, right? So phenology mismatch is that the timing of these seasonal activities, for example flowering or leaf senescence or breeding, it's actually advanced because, as I said, summer is starting earlier and earlier. So these activities are also moving earlier because early on the birds or these different organisms, they start experiencing higher temperatures. And because a lot of these seasonal activities, they have these certain triggers, for example, most of which are day length, temperatures, precipitation, things like that. And because all of these are shifting, so this phenomena is also shifting, and a lot of these phenomena are dependent on each other, and that is where the phenology mismatch comes in. So, a limited period of the year only gives you favorable enough conditions to successfully reproduce and to grow, right? So, as I explained, so it's not that throughout the year these organisms can keep undergoing, reproduction and growth. There's only a very limited period of the year in which these conditions are favorable for them to successfully undergo these processes. And when there is a mismatch between the phenology of different species, that is when the problem comes in. Because, so now I'll give you an example. A lot of these species are interdependent. So if there is a species of plant which flowers in certain months, and there's a species of bees, so if bee reproduction happens earlier but the flowers have not but the plants have not flowered yet, then where will the bees get the nectar from to feed their young, to feed their larvae? So this is called phenology mismatch, in which earlier the bees reproduction and the flowering of these plants were actually timed at the same time in the season, during the same season. But now it has been delinked because of the temperature changes, because of the seasonality changes, right? So there has been a decoupling of phenology within these trophic levels, which leads to a loss of biodiversity, because those bees might not be able to survive now because they don't have food to consume, right? So a very famous example of this comes from when the study carried out on these woodland passerine species and how they were being impacted by a mismatch of phenology between these passerine species, which are actually the tits and the warblers, which actually consume the caterpillars in the area. So what was happening is that because of an increased temperature, the insects or the caterpillars, the insect laid eggs, and the eggs hatched earlier because of increased temperature, and so the time shifted forward for the caterpillars. But the birds, they still laid eggs in their own time, and but when they're by the time the hatchlings or the eggs hatched for the birds, all the caterpillars were actually gone, and the birds did not have anything to consume or to feed their young, and their populations declined. Another thing that was very famously observed is these cherry blossoms. You might be already aware that cherry trees and the cherry blossoms is a very famous phenomenon in Japan, all over Japan. And it's been thousands of years that Japanese people have been keeping logs of how this cherry blossoming is happening, and a lot of ecotourism also goes into this phenomena. So they see that every year these cherry trees have been blossoming earlier and earlier because of these increased temperatures. So there's a mismatch in the phenology of different species. Then another thing that has been observed is that temperature increase has also affected the pests, and they have increased the amount of pests. So pest infestations and new kinds of pests are now being seen across the world, and the warming, how global warming is impacting insects is very complex. It is leading to increase in certain populations and decrease in certain other populations. So you see that there can be an increased number of generations, that within the same time, instead of one generation, there are multiple generations because of high temperatures. There's expansion in geographic range, which leads to species that were just here expanding to other areas, and they might become pests in those areas. There is an outbreak of plant diseases. There is increased overwintering survival. So the insects are supposed to die during the winter because temperature is high. Winter is not as harsh. They're not dying in the winter, or they're not hibernating, and that is impacting the plants and other organisms that they might be parasitizing on. And then there is a desynchronization between insects and their natural enemies. So predators are also not able to consume these insects, as I already said, because there is a de-link between their timings. And there is also a loss of synchrony with the host plant as well. The plant might not have new leaves by the time the insects come to the plant, right? So this is different ways in which global warming is actually impacting the biodiversity in phenology. Then you come to another phenomena which is called the forest dieback. So forest dieback is a phenomena in which you observe an increased amount of tree mortality. So you see trees dying more than what is normally expected, and that is due to rising temperature, which might be leading to drying of leaves, which might be causing a direct mortality of the trees, or might be causing increased pest infestation in these trees, and a decreased immunity of the trees to fight off these different pests. So the balance of the ecosystem gets disrupted, and the climate change actually impacts what is the timing of leaf growth, what is the senescence, how they're deteriorating, and what is the availability of vital resources. And if the trees, they fail to adapt to these different changes in temperature and precipitation and seasonality, then they become more and more vulnerable and stressed. The trees that are stressed, that are facing these stressed conditions, high temperatures, they face diseases and pests. They face more and more diseases and get more pest infestation. So that is forest dieback, and with this image you can see that a huge chunk of this forest is actually dead, while the rest of them are alive. So this one species of trees has been. So you can also observe that in this image, this entire dry species is the same species of trees. It's been largely impacted by the climate change. Then ocean warming and coral reefs. How are coral reefs, or how is the ecosystem impacted here? We're talking about coral bleaching. So you might be aware that a healthy coral consists of a coral, or a cnidarian, which is a marine cnidarian, and an algae, which are both in a symbiotic relationship, in a mutualism together. So corals have a symbiotic relationship with microscopic algae, and which are called zooxanthellae, and these zooxanthellae live inside the tissues of these corals. And these algae, in this image you can see, this is the coral, the cnidarian, and these are the algae. And these algae are the primary food source for the corals, and they give them a lot of nutrients, and they also give them the color that the corals have. Now, what is stress is when the temperatures increase, the algae um, they start producing these particles which are uh, not good for the coral. So they start producing a lot of these free radicals when the temperatures are high. So then the algae, they leave the coral, or the cnidarians, they actually kick out the algae, and which leads to the bleaching of the cnidarians. But now you can, like, see that there is no food also for them, because they have lost a major source of the food because there's no algae, and they also look white or pale. But yeah, coral bleaching is also a reversible phenomena. If you make the conditions okay again, if you reduce the make the conditions suitable again, then the algae can re-inhabit these corals and make them healthy corals again. But yeah, that is how coral bleaching happened. And what causes coral bleaching is changes in ocean temperature, increase in amount of temperature, a lot of this runoff from industrial runoff, a lot of exposure to sunlight, and extremely low tide. These are some causes of coral bleaching. This is what a healthy coral looks like, which is like full of algae, and which are algae are also consumed by these fish. And if the coral is bleached, there is no algae, there's nothing for the fish also to consume. And so it's not just the coral that is being impacted, but the entire coral ecosystem gets impacted, right? So you can see here how starkly white the bleached corals look, and the other ones are so colorful. Moving on to another thing, which is the spread of invasive species. So here we're going to talk about this invasive species called Lantana camara, which has been spreading throughout the globe. But India has been facing a lot of this problem of the spreading of lantana. So let's watch this short video, which talks about what is lantana and how it's spreading throughout the country and how it was brought into the country.
Late 17th, 16th, and 17th centuries, there was this fashion amongst European people to collect things from, especially tropical places, and sort of transplant them to other places, either their colonies or back on the European continent.
Initially grown in the managed areas, it has now escaped and invaded about 3 lakh square kilometer of India. But how did this happen?
From what I last read, the first introductions were in the Calcutta Botanical Gardens. But studies have shown that there were multiple points of introduction along the west coast as well as along the east coast.
Imagine bringing home a piece of wooden furniture, unaware of a termite infestation in it. And soon enough, you will notice that those termites would have damaged your other wooden items as well. This is exactly what happens when you bring a live lantana in your garden. Lantana or Lantana camara is a beautiful ornamental plant, but it outcompetes its neighboring plants and does not let anything grow around it. The colorful flowers attract butterflies and birds that spread its seeds and further aid its uncontrolled growth in the surrounding areas. In fact, that is why lantana is considered among the world's 10 worst weeds. Unfortunately, it also loves the Indian climatic conditions.
There's nothing eating this plant, there's no herbivores. They could form associations with local fauna, such as butterflies, for pollinating their flowers, so that there's lots more seed set.
With little favors from the butterflies and birds visiting the flowers, the plant has been expanding itself. Lantana's ability to make dense thickets makes the food underneath it, the grass, forage, inaccessible to the wild animals, especially endangered species such as elephants, gaurs and deers. This may cause an imbalance in the food chain.
Actually, to control the population of a plant, you need to attack the seeds of the plant. So it's actually the invertebrate species. Such species have not started using lantana yet.
Interestingly, no animal, no insect is yet known to be attacking lantana, which means that unless this plant is physically uprooted or cut away, there is no way to control it. Recently, a new method is being used to remove lantana. It's called the cut root stock method. In this, the stem 3 inch under the ground is removed from the roots. This is suggested to be helping in containing the plant's growth, but it's very manual and labor-intensive job. So, if you are wondering, alright, I understand lantana is a problem, but how does that affect me, or what can I do? See, if we were to remove all of lantana today, Studies suggest it'll take up to rupees 40,000 crores. This is roughly 1% of India's annual budget. Money that essentially comes out of our pockets in form of taxes and money that can be better utilized elsewhere. The least we can do is to stop buying or growing lantana in our gardens or outside office buildings. Secondly, forest fires. Some of you may recall the 2019-2020 forest fires from Australia. There are mostly two types of forest fires. One, ground fire. Second, canopy fire. In 2019, what Australia experienced was one of the worst canopy wildfires, killing birds, animals, and a number of plant species. India usually experiences ground fires. However, certain lantanas grow as climbers on trees and act as fuel ladders, meaning a ground fire can reach the leaves and the branches of the tree, resulting in more ground fires becoming canopy fires. And if this is not enough, not that lantana is only a fiscal or ecological problem, it is a toxic plant. Its leaves cause rashes and skin irritation. The raw berries upon ingestion can cause diarrhea, liver failure, and in some cases even death.
Late 17th, 16th, and 17th.
So this was all about lantana camera and how it is invasive, and how these invasive species actually spread throughout the uh, new or alien habitat, and they outcompete the native species, and they take over the entire habitat and make it difficult for the natives to survive, right? Okay, coming to the physiological impacts of climate change. So these were the ecological level impacts of climate change. What are some physiological impacts that impact certain species? So first of all, there was a study carried out in these marine eel pouts, which are these viviparous fish, which actually, because of the heating up of the oceans, they were facing a limitation in oxygen, and because of their thermal tolerance, and this thermal or heating up of the ocean and the oxygen consumption, it actually impacted individuals, and was not even fatal to the individuals, but still led to a decline in the population of these fish species. And that is how they've become these bioindicators, because if you get a low population of these species, that means the ocean temperatures are much higher than they should be. So yeah, so it might be it might not even be fatal to the organisms, but will still affect the populations. And the other thing is, there is this species called the Himalayan snow trout. It's another species which is a very small thermal niche, and it stays in the cold waters, but because the temperatures have been rising, they have been um, stressed to move their niche a little upwards towards the higher altitudes. But there's not, as we discussed, there's not always space on the top, because where will they go? There are other species there, they might face competition in that newer habitat, they might not be able to live there, their food species or their what they are dependent on might not be there in the upper elevations. So that is another way in which these species are facing impacts of the climate change. So how do humans impact habitats? Now let's discuss how we as humans are impacting habitats. There is degradation, which refers to the condition where the quality of the habitat has been severely affected by human actions. There is fragmentation. Natural landscapes are broken off into smaller fragments. Displacement. The wildlife is forced to shift from their prime habitats to subprime habitats. And loss. The quality of the habitat is degraded to such an extent that it cannot be occupied by any species any longer. So this is these different types of habitat changes. Here you can see this is a form of habitat loss. This is fragmentation, in which it has been fragmented into two landscapes. This is degradation, and this again here is degradation and eutrophication, right? Now, how to conserve the biodiversity of these areas? There are two approaches. You can either have in situ conservation or ex situ conservation. In situ conservation means the conservation practices which are done with the natural habitat of the given species, within the natural habitat of the given species. So you're not trying to move the species away from its natural habitat, but you're trying to protect it within the habitat. For example, including national parks, biosphere reserves, and wildlife sanctuaries. These areas you're trying to make more and more areas inclusive of the green cover, so that more species can stay within these areas. So the steps to think here are which areas to make into a reserve, which areas to convert. So areas that have more endemic species, that have more threatened species, those should be given preference while making reserved forests. Shape and size of the forest reserve, and how do you manage the reserve? These are different questions that you can think about while uh, establishing biosphere reserves, right? And how do you choose areas for in situ conservation? You look for areas which have a higher species richness. As I said, the species richness should be high. The amount of endemism in the area should be high, that those species are found only there and nowhere else. And there should be a higher number of species that are under threat. So it should either be a which falls under biodiversity hotspots. And India has these four biodiversity hotspots, one of them being the Himalayan zone. Then there is this Indo-Burma, Sundaland in the Andamans, and then the Western Ghats, right? And the biosphere reserves in India has a lot of these biosphere reserves, which actually have been marked in this map. We have a total of 18 biosphere reserves, where a lot of these species are being protected against habitat loss and degradation. So there are different definitions that I've put together in this slide, and you can look through them while going through the slides when you have time. So we talk about how wildlife sanctuaries are different from biosphere reserves and how they are different from national parks. Now we come to ex situ conservation. Ex situ is conservation in which you're trying to save the population but off site. So you take the so this only happens when there is an urgent intervention required. For example, in the case of the Great Indian Bustards, because they were losing their population, was dwindling in a very fast manner. So we had to bring in the eggs and raise the chicks inside safe environments, and so that they don't face all these stresses that they're actually facing in the natural environment. So you're trying to save them, for example, in areas like zoos, aquariums, or captively breeding them, or botanical gardens for plants and seed banks, right? So it happens, ex situ conservation is only undertaken under urgent intervention requirements, and they're usually for critically endangered species. There are pros and cons to ex situ conservation. Pros includes that you can have a better control in the variables, for example, climate changes, diseases, diet. So you can control all of these variables and protect the species against them. It only requires a small area, and you can closely observe the species, and there are you can take care of you can take intensive interventions in this. So you can even carry out in vitro fertilization, which means that you can even control the genetics of the species, and you can protect injured individuals and help them survive. But there are some cons to ex situ conservation. For example, those species, they lose their wild behavior. They do not know how to stay. If you leave them, you cannot actually release them in the wild again, without them being properly trained how to stay in the wild environments. You may not be able to survive if reintroduced into the wild. Does not help with protecting habitat. So it's this ex situ conservation is not really helping you protect the habitat that has actually been impacted, which is causing the species to become endangered in the first place. Cannot protect multiple species together. It is only very, very focused towards one particular species that is endangered. It's a costly mechanism. It can increase the chances of inbreeding, and inbreeding, as you know, leads to lower quality individuals, which might not be very fit or well adapted to the areas. Ex situ conservations, though, still has some of its success stories. For example, the Przewalski's horse. It comes from this Gobi area, northwards of China, and they were last found on the Mongolian steppes of the Gobi Desert in 1960s. And approximately 1900 Przewalski's horses are alive today, and all of them have descended from only 14 founder species that were caught in the wild between 1910 and 1960. So right now the population has been increased to around 1900. It was the last surviving subspecies of wild horse. This was driven to extinction in the wild in 1960s by a combination of pressures. For example, there was hunting of these horses, there was competition with livestock for food, and there were military activities and a lot of climate change. Because these horses are found in this very cold environments, it means that they were more susceptible to climate change as well. So they maintained the captive bred individuals. The species was then reintroduced into Mongolia, and now there are several hundred free ranging individuals. So this is a success story for captive breeding. Other success stories involve ex situ management, contributed to an improvement in the conservation status of 18 species over a 10-year period. One of them is the black-footed ferret. One of them, as we discussed, was the Przewalski's horse, which were actually have now been reintroduced after having been claimed to be extinct in the wild. And species that have not disappeared in the wild but were at risk of disappearing. For example, the Mauritius Foddy, they have also been protected by ex situ conservation practices. Last but not the least, let's discuss the conservation efforts that have been successful for the tigers as well. On the World Wildlife Day, 10 conservation stories. So here you can go to this article and read the success stories of conservations that will actually make you feel better. And another one is this 12 conservation stories in which so if you look at this tab, you see these some there are some 10 conservation stories. For example, conservation of whale species back from their brink, joint effort to save the Red Sea corals, England's first wild beaver colony in 400 years, the mountain gorilla numbers which were actually recovered, bald eagle numbers returned to their former glory, then tiger populations have become better, then there are brown pelicans and the grey wolf, stellar sea lions, and the panda, which is the conservation symbol, WWF, right? So these are the different success stories for XC2 conservation, right? One second. Yeah. Now let's come to the Q&A session for this class. So I will give you 10 seconds to answer each question before I tell you the answers. So I hope this lecture was helpful and you would have learned something from today's meeting. So first question is, what is global warming? So what do you mean by global warming? Is it a short-term temperature change? It's a gradual increase in the Earth's average surface temperature. Is it the expansion of deserts or is it the seasonal weather patterns? So what really is global warming? And so yeah, the correct answer, as you might have already guessed, is global warming is the gradual increase in the Earth's average surface temperature. Second question is, what gas is a major contributor to global warming? Is it oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, or helium? Which of these four gases is a major contributor to global warming? And so, yeah, the correct answer to this question is carbon dioxide. Third question is, greenhouse effect refers to what? Is it the heat released by volcanoes? Is it the earth cooling due to ice caps? Is it the trapping of heat in the atmosphere by greenhouse gases? Or planting trees in greenhouses? So, what is the greenhouse effect? Yeah. So the correct answer is trapping of heat in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. Which human activity contributes most to climate change? Is it swimming, using solar panels, burning fossil fuels, or riding bicycles? Which of these activities contributes most to climate change? So the correct answer is burning of fossil fuels. Question number 5, what does biodiversity refer to? Is it the number of countries in the world, variety of living organisms in the ecosystem, amount of water in an area, or types of weather in a region? So, what is biodiversity when we are uh, talking about biodiversity? Yeah. So, the correct answer is the variety of living organisms that are found in an ecosystem. That is what is biodiversity. Next question is, one major cause of biodiversity loss is ecotourism, deforestation, organic farming, or rainfall? And so, yeah, the correct answer is, as you might have already guessed, deforestation. Invasive species affect biodiversity by doing what? By increasing food supply for native species, by helping with pollination, by outcompeting native species and disrupting ecosystems, or by reducing pollution. So, your 10 seconds start now. So the correct answer is outcompeting native species and disrupting ecosystems. That is how invasive species are affecting biodiversity. So they lead to a biodiversity loss in the area where they invade. Conservation aims to remove all wild animals from nature, protect and manage natural resources and biodiversity, promote hunting and deforestation, or build more factories. And so, yeah, the correct answer is conservation aims to protect and manage natural resources and biodiversity. Threats to biodiversity are land use change, invasive species, overexploitation, human wildlife conflict, or all of these above. So, what are the threats to biodiversity? And so, yeah, the correct answer to this question is all of the above. So, all of these land use change, invasive species, overexploitation, and human wildlife conflict are some threats to the biodiversity. What can genetics help conservation biologists with? So, how can genetics play a role for conservation biologists? You can estimate the genetic diversity of a population. You can look at migration events or animal movement. You can infer uh, species demography, or you can bring back dinosaurs to life, or A, B, and C. So, what is the correct answer to how can genetics help conservation biologists? And so, the correct answer to this question, as you might have already guessed, is A, B, and C. Question number 11. Okay, I'm sorry for that. Yeah. So, next question is corals form a symbiotic relationship between dash, which is a sea invertebrate, and dash. Is it a polyp and an aquatic algae, a crustacean and a marine algae, cnidarian and a marine algae, or a cetacean and a marine algae? So, what is the coral a symbiotic relationship between? And so, yeah, the correct answer is a cnidarian and a marine algae, as I discussed in this slide. The integrity of the Earth system is defined by six planetary boundaries that regulate the Earth's stability, nine planetary processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system, climate change in an integral process contributing to the resilience of the Earth system, or all of the above. So, what is the Earth's integrity defined by? And yeah, so the correct answer to this question is nine planetary processes that regulate the stability and resilience of the Earth system. Last question for today. The stability and resilience of the Earth's system and human well being are inseparable. Why? Because the Earth's biotic and abiotic factors are connected, because Earth is a complex system, human society is dependent on the Earth system, or all of these above. So, how is the stability of the Earth system and human well being inseparable? And so, the correct answer to this question is that human society is dependent on the Earth system. So, this was all for today. Thank you for joining or listening to this YouTube video. And I hope it was helpful, and I hope you got something to learn from today's lecture. Thank you.